Welcome to another episode of real-life haunted stories. If you love chilling tales and spine-tingling horror stories, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a scare. New nightmares drop every week. Stay haunted. So, let's start our today's episode. Story 1. The Curse of Durgapur Village. It was a small, forgotten village in West Bengal, Durgapur, not to be confused with the bustling industrial city of the same name. This Durgapur was isolated, surrounded by dense forests, its air thick with folklore and whispered warnings. Outsiders rarely visited, and those who did often left unsettled, speaking of strange occurrences that defied logic. I first heard of Durgapur through a retired government surveyor named Narayan Sen, who had spent his youth documenting remote settlements. He recalled something unnatural about this place, an entire family vanishing overnight, a pond that seemed cursed, and an abandoned house that no one dared approach after sundown. In 1997, a young schoolteacher named Anirban Mukherjee was assigned to Durgapur's only primary school. He arrived in high spirits, eager to make a difference. Within weeks, he would experience terror beyond his imagination. Anirban arrived on a humid August afternoon, carrying a single suitcase. The villagers welcomed him politely, but with an underlying hesitation. He noticed their glances, as if warning him of something they dared not speak. His quarters were in an old house at the edge of the village, near a pond covered in thick green algae. The house had been unoccupied for years. The landlord, an elderly man named Dinesh Babu, handed him the keys with an odd warning. Close your windows after sundown, and if you hear someone calling your name at night, do not answer. Anirban laughed it off, assuming it was just an attempt to spook him. But by the second night, he began to understand why. At first, the occurrences were subtle, a feeling of being watched, objects not staying where he left them, the distant sound of anklets clicking on the wooden floor at night. Then, on his fourth night, as he graded papers under the dim glow of a kerosene lamp, he heard a whisper. Anirban. It was soft, almost playful, coming from just outside the window. He froze. Anirban. The voice was familiar. It sounded like his mother's. His heart pounded. He hadn't told anyone in the village about his family. The voice came again, now from the front door. Open the door, Beta. His mother was miles away in Kolkata. This was impossible. He clenched his fists and remained silent. The knocking on the door started, slow at first, then frenzied. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Morning came with an eerie silence. The villagers avoided eye contact. When he mentioned the incident to Dinesh Babu, the old man sighed. You heard her, didn't you? Who? The woman by the pond. Dinesh Babu told him the story. Decades ago, a young widow named Charulata had lived in the same house. She was beautiful, but misfortune followed her. Her husband had died mysteriously, and the village accused her of being a Dayan witch. One stormy night, the villagers dragged her to the pond and drowned her. Some claim she cursed them with her dying breath. Since then, strange things had happened. People saw her reflection in the pond, even when no one was there. The house was abandoned after a family went missing overnight, leaving all their belongings behind. Anirban, ever the rational man, refused to believe the story. But that night, the horror escalated. He woke up gasping. Something cold pressed against his chest. A shape loomed over him, a silhouette of a woman, her eyes hollow voids, her face twisted in sorrow and rage. She whispered, "Save me." He couldn't move. A suffocating pressure weighed him down. His breath turned shallow. Just when he thought he would pass out, the pressure lifted and the shadow vanished. Terrified, he fled to the village temple and spent the night there. The priest, an old man named Shamlal, listened intently and nodded. She is trapped. Trapped where? Between this world and the next. He explained that Charulata's restless spirit remained near the pond, reliving her final moments. She called out to men at night, sometimes in familiar voices, hoping someone would free her. But anyone who answered her vanished. The only way to end it was to perform a moksha kriya, a final rite to release her spirit. But someone had to go to the pond at midnight to do it. With the priest guiding him, a Nirban stood at the pond's edge, holding a brass diya. The water was eerily still. He recited the chants, his voice trembling. A gust of wind howled. The water churned violently. A shadowy figure rose, a woman in a red sari, her hair floating unnaturally, her eyes filled with unspoken agony. "Free me!" A Nirban hesitated but continued chanting. The wind roared. The diya flickered. The shadow let out a blood-curdling scream, and then silence. The air grew lighter. The water calmed. The presence was gone. Anirban stayed in the village for another year, but the nightmares ceased. The villagers said the pond felt different, lighter, as if something dark had finally left. Years later, when he returned to visit, he found the house demolished, the pond dried up. No one spoke of Charulata anymore. It was as if she had never existed. But Anirban knew better. Even today, sometimes in his dreams, he still hears a whisper, soft, almost pleading. "Save me." Story 2, The Haunting of Jhargram Village. Jhargram, a small village in West Bengal, is known for its dense forests, ancient temples, and tribal folklore. But among the villagers, one place remained untouched. The Banerjee Mansion. For nearly 50 years, it had stood abandoned, its wooden doors sealed shut, its windows covered in dust and ivy. The locals refused to go near it, whispering about the Shokuni, a restless spirit that wandered the halls at night. In 2012, a young journalist named Ritwik Das Kumprada arrived in Jhargram. He was researching forgotten places with eerie pasts, and the Banerjee Mansion was his perfect story. He never expected that the house was waiting for him. The mansion stood on the outskirts of Jhargram, surrounded by trees that swayed eerily even when there was no wind. Ritwik had spoken to some villagers, but they refused to talk about it. Only one man, an old farmer named Haradan Kaka, agreed to speak. "Why do you want to go there?" he asked. "I heard it's haunted." Haradan Kaka's face darkened. "Not haunted, cursed." He told Ritwik about Pabatarini Banerjee, the last resident of the house. 50 years ago, she was a young widow who had lived alone. The villagers believed she was a daini, a witch. One night, during a lunar eclipse, she was found hanging from a banyan tree in the courtyard. Some say she was murdered. Others believe she took her own life in despair. But from that night, people claimed to see her shadow in the mansion's windows. Anyone who tried to enter either fell sick, lost their mind, or never returned. Ritwik, ever the skeptic, dismissed the tale. He had explored countless abandoned places before. This would be no different. Or so he thought. Ritwick arrived at the mansion just before sunset. The rusted iron gates groaned as he pushed them open. Dry leaves crackled under his feet as he stepped onto the porch. The door was unlocked. Inside, dust covered everything. The furniture remained, as if the residents had left in a hurry. Faded portraits of the Banerjee family lined the walls, but one portrait stood out. A woman in a red sari, her eyes piercing through the canvas. Baba Tarini. That night, Ritwick set up his camera and notes in the main hall. The silence was deafening. Then, at exactly 2:13 a.m., he heard it. A faint knocking from the second floor. He froze. The house was supposed to be empty. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate. It came from the master bedroom, the same room where Baba Tarini had lived. Summoning his courage, he climbed the stairs, flashlight in hand. The air grew colder. The door to the room was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. A sudden gust of wind blew out his flashlight. In the darkness, he heard breathing. Then, a whisper. "Ritwick, you finally came." Ritwick's blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakably a woman's. He fumbled with his flashlight, the beam flickering. And then, he saw it. Behind the old curtain near the window, a shadow moved. A tall, thin figure standing unnaturally still. Ritwick's body refused to move. Then the shadow stepped forward. The curtain dropped. There was no one there. Heart pounding, Ritwick grabbed his bag and fled downstairs. As he reached the main hall, he noticed something that hadn't been there before. The portrait of Baba Tarini had changed. Her head was now tilted to the side, and her lips had curled into a faint, sinister smile. The next morning, Ritwick found an old wooden chest in the corner of the hall. Inside, he discovered a pot diary. It belonged to Baba Tarini. The last pages were disturbing. "They watch me. They whisper at my door. They call me a witch, but I only wait. I wait for someone to listen." Then, the final entry. "On the next lunar eclipse, I will be free, but only if one takes my place." Ritwick shuddered. The next lunar eclipse was that very night. Haradan Kaka had warned him about the Shokuni, a restless spirit that seeks to trap the living in its place. If what the diary said was true, then Baba Tarini's spirit was waiting for someone to take her place. That night, Ritwick stayed in the house, determined to witness the truth. At midnight, he felt the air shift. The temperature dropped. The front door slammed shut on its own. Then, footsteps. Slow, heavy, coming from the staircase. He turned on his camera. A shadow appeared at the top of the stairs. Tall, draped in a red sari, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. It was Baba Tarini. "Take my place." The whisper came from right behind him. Ritwick ran. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with whispers. He reached for the door, but it wouldn't budge. Behind him, the shadow moved closer. Desperate, he pulled out a matchbox he always carried. With shaking hands, he struck a match and threw it at the diary. The moment the pages caught fire, the house trembled. A scream, inhuman and filled with rage, echoed through the mansion. The portrait of Baba Tarini burst into flames. And then, silence. The door suddenly swung open. Ritwick didn't look back. He ran until he collapsed near the village temple. The next morning, villagers found Ritwick unconscious near the temple. The mansion, untouched for decades, had finally collapsed overnight. The legend of Baba Tarini Banerjee faded. The whispers stopped. But Ritwick never forgot. Even years later, When he played the recording from that night, he always heard one last whisper before the tape cut out. "I will wait." Story 3. The Vanishing Village of Rakshapur. Deep in the forests of Odisha, on the border of West Bengal, there was a village called Rakshapur, a name that meant protected land. But in reality, no one was protected there. By 1985, the village had vanished. No records, no survivors, just ruins swallowed by the jungle. People who dared to visit claimed to hear voices calling from the trees, see shadowy figures wandering in the mist, and feel something watching them. In 2017, a group of 4 urban explorers set out to find the lost village. Only one returned, and what he saw was beyond belief. The group consisted of Rajiv, the skeptic, Priya, the photographer, Kabir, the historian, and Manav, the guide. They had heard whispers about Rakshapur, a village that had supposedly disappeared overnight. No one in the surrounding areas spoke of it, and locals warned them not to go. The village was cursed, said an old tea seller in the nearest town. People there worshipped something that took them all. Ignoring the warnings, the group followed an old, nearly invisible forest path, using GPS coordinates they had found in a rare government document. But as soon as they entered the jungle, the GPS malfunctioned. Then, the compass spun wildly. And then, they saw the first sign that something was wrong. A row of decayed wooden dolls hung from the trees, each with its eyes gouged out. After hours of walking, they found it, Rakshapur. The village was eerily intact. The mud huts stood as if frozen in time, but there were no signs of life. Plates of food, now rotted, still sat on dining tables. Clothes remained on drying lines. It was as if the villagers had simply walked away in the middle of their lives. Priya began taking photographs. Rajiv laughed, mocking the ghost stories. But then, Kabir found something disturbing. Near the village temple, there was a huge stone altar covered in dried blood. And around it, symbols were carved, not in any known script. That's when Manav, the guide, turned pale. "We need to leave, now." As evening fell, a thick mist rolled in unnaturally fast. The temperature dropped. Then, from the forest, they heard voices, whispers, chanting, and then a child's voice. "Help me, I'm lost." Priya, who had a younger brother, instinctively ran toward the sound. Kabir and Rajiv followed, trying to stop her, but Manav, he stayed behind, shaking his head. "They are calling you. Don't go." The mist thickened, and the 3 disappeared into it. Moments later, the screaming began. Manav, frozen in terror, watched as shadowy figures emerged from the mist, tall, thin, their eyes glowing red. They surrounded the stone altar and began to chant in an unknown language. Rajiv stumbled out of the mist, his face twisted in terror. "They took them! They took them into the ground!" But Priya and Kabir were nowhere to be seen. Then, the ground beneath the altar began to crack open. A black, withered hand reached out. The villagers had worshipped something here, and it was still hungry. Manav grabbed Rajiv and ran. They sprinted through the jungle, ignoring the voices calling their names. When they finally burst out of the forest, the mist vanished, and so did the path behind them. Rakshapur was gone. Rajiv was never the same. He refused to speak about what happened. A month later, he was found hanging from his apartment ceiling, his eyes gouged out. Manav told the story once, then left India forever, and Priya and Kabir. They were never found. Some say the lost villagers got new worshippers that night, and Rakshapur, it remains hidden, waiting for the next visitors. Story 4. The Curse of Bulanpur. Bulanpur was a small village in Bihar, hidden deep in the countryside. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, except for one thing. No one in Bulanpur lived past the age of 35. The villagers accepted it as fate. Some said it was a curse, others whispered of a bargain made long ago, but no one ever spoke about it to outsiders. Then, in 2019, a young doctor named Samar Verma was sent to Bulanpur for government service. He didn't believe in curses, but in just 3 weeks, he would realize that some things are not meant to be questioned, and some secrets must stay buried. Samar arrived in Bulanpur on a bright morning, carrying a medical bag and a notebook. He had read about the village's strange mortality rate. People never aged beyond 35. He wanted to understand why, but the villagers refused to answer his questions. They only gave him nervous glances and changed the subject. The village head, an old man named Keshav Thakur, finally spoke. "Dr. Sahib, don't ask too much. Some things are better left alone." But Samar was determined. He examined the health records. There were no genetic diseases, no clear medical explanation. It was as if something took them. Then, on his 4th night in Bulanpur, he heard the drums. At exactly midnight, a low rhythmic drumming echoed through the village. Curious, Samar stepped outside and saw something chilling. The villagers, men, women, even children, were walking toward the old banyan tree at the edge of the village. Their faces were blank, their eyes glassy, unfocused. No one spoke. No one acknowledged him. Then they began to chant. Samar followed them from a distance, hiding behind a haystack. The air felt heavy, charged with something ancient and powerful. And then he saw it. A figure stood beneath the banyan tree. Tall, unnaturally thin, its limbs too long, its face hidden beneath a hood. The villagers knelt before it, and the thing raised its hand. At that moment, the wind howled, and Samar felt something grip his chest, like invisible fingers tightening around his heart. He gasped for breath, and then everything went black. Samar woke up in his hut, drenched in sweat. Had he imagined it? The next morning, he confronted Keshav Thakur. What was that? Who was under the tree? The old man's face turned pale. "Leave, Dr. Sahib, before it chooses you." Samar refused. He had to know. That evening he searched the village archives and found an old, crumbling diary written in 1886 by a British officer named Captain Robert Henshaw. The entries made his blood run cold. The people in Bulanpur worship something in the forest. They make a pact with it. In exchange for prosperity, they must offer their young before they grow old. If they fail, it takes them all. Samar's hands trembled. This was no disease, no genetic mystery. It was a sacrifice. And his name was next. That night, Samar noticed something strange on his wrist. A small black symbol, like an eye with jagged lines around it. He scrubbed at it, but it wouldn't come off. Then he heard a whisper. "Dr. Sahib, it is too late." He spun around, but there was no one there. Outside, the drumming started again, and this time they were calling his name. Samar didn't wait. He grabbed his bag and ran toward his jeep. But as he reached the village gate, a figure stood blocking the road. The same tall, hooded thing from the night before. It tilted its head, and then it moved toward him, faster than anything human. Samar screamed and jumped into the jeep. The engine roared to life. He didn't look back as he sped down the narrow dirt road, but just before he left Bulhanpur behind, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The villagers stood in a perfect line, watching him go, and each of them was smiling. Samar survived. He never went back. The mark on his wrist never faded, and sometimes late at night, he still hears the drums, because Bulhanpur never lets go of its chosen. Story 5. The Whispering Well of Devapur. In the heart of Jharkhand, nestled between thick forests and rolling hills, there was a village called Devapur, a quiet place, untouched by modernity, but at its center stood something that no one dared to go near. An ancient well. The well had been sealed for over a century, covered with thick iron bars and heavy stones. The villagers believed that something lived inside, something that spoke when the wind was right. No one was allowed near it after dark. In 2018, a young school teacher named Ananya Mishra was sent to Devapur. She had heard the stories. She didn't believe them, but she should have. Ananya arrived in Devapur with excitement. She had always wanted to work in rural areas to make a difference. The villagers welcomed her warmly until she asked about the well. A heavy silence fell. The village head, Dhaniramji, shook his head. "Stay away from it, Betty. It is not for outsiders." Ananya laughed nervously. "It's just a well, right?" No one answered. That night, as she settled into her small cottage near the school, she heard it, the faint voice, calling her name. "Ananya, come closer." She froze. It was coming from outside. It was coming from the well. The next morning, Ananya asked an old woman, Ma Janki, about the well. At first, the woman refused to speak, but after much pleading, she whispered, "The well belonged to the Thakur family. Their daughter Chaya was thrown inside 100 years ago, but she never left." Ananya frowned. "She survived?" Ma Janki shook her head. Her body was never found, but her voice remained. That night, Ananya lay awake, listening. At exactly 2 a.m., the whispering started again. "Ananya, I'm waiting." A gust of wind rattled her windows, and then she heard scratching at her door. Slow, deliberate, something wanted to come in. Determined to prove the villagers wrong, Ananya decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, she approached the well the next evening. The iron bars and stones were still in place, but then she saw it. A fresh handprint on the stones, small, like a child's. A chill ran down her spine, but before she could turn away, a whisper brushed against her ear. "Help me." Ananya gasped. Her hands trembled. Against her better judgment, she reached out and touched the stones. At that moment, a cold hand grabbed her wrist. She screamed and stumbled backward, but when she looked again, there was nothing, just the whisper. "You let me out. Now I will come to you." That night, the whispers followed her home. They came from the walls, from under her bed, from inside the mirror. Then, at exactly 2 a.m., her door creaked open. A shadow stood at the threshold, small, with long, tangled hair. The air turned ice cold. Then it moved. It crawled. Ananya couldn't scream. She couldn't move. last thing she saw before blacking out was a pair of faint, milky white eyes staring into hers. When Ananya woke up, she was in Ma Janki's hut. The old woman sighed. "She has marked you now." Terrified, Ananya begged for answers. Ma Janki finally revealed the truth. 100 years ago, Chaya was accused of witchcraft by her own family. They threw her into the well and sealed it, even as she screamed for mercy. But she never died. The villagers believed her spirit couldn't escape unless someone touched the stones. Ananya had set her free, and now Chaya wouldn't leave her alone. Ma Janki performed rituals, but the whispers never stopped. Ananya grew weaker, unable to sleep, unable to think. Then, on the 7th night, she woke up to something stroking her hair. Slow, gentle, she turned her head and her heart stopped. Chaya lay beside her. Her face was decayed, her lips stretched into a grotesque smile. And in her hollow voice, she whispered, "Now, it's your turn." The next morning, Ananya was gone. Her room was empty, her belongings untouched. But when the villagers checked the well, the stones had been removed. And in the darkness below, the whispers began again, waiting for the next visitor. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, to show your support, comment to share your thoughts or ask questions, and don't forget to subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload.